On behalf of Governor Nome and the South Dakota Department of Agriculture, welcome to the 10th Annual Governor's Agricultural Summit. My name is Maggie Stensis. I'm the Strategic Communications Officer for the South Dakota Department of Agriculture, and I'm going to be your MC over the next couple days. I grew up on a hobby farm in Minnesota, and I started working on neighboring dairy farms when I was 12 years old. And my passion for agriculture led me to South Dakota State University, where I studied dairy production and speech communication with a minor in animal science. So I'm very fortunate to be able to use both of my degrees on a daily basis, working to promote, protect, and preserve South Dakota agriculture for today and tomorrow. Our program this afternoon and tomorrow morning was thoughtfully constructed to generate dialogue amongst South Dakota farmers and ranchers, business and industry partners, and others involved in the agricultural community here in our state. Agriculture is one of our state's largest economic drivers, and it is so important that we take time every year to gather and discuss what has happened in our great agricultural community and what we have to look forward to in the coming years. I want to start the day by giving a special thanks to Summit sponsors for their support. Because of their generosity, we are able to present this conference without a registration fee. This sponsorship reflects the substantial value these businesses and organizations place on the relationships and strategic discussions that grow during the Governor's Agricultural Summit. Please join me in thanking our sponsors for their generosity. As we begin this afternoon, I want to remind everyone joining us online to tweet questions that they have for our panelists to the department's Twitter at SD Agriculture using the hashtag SDAgSummit. Now we're going to jump right in and hear from South Dakota Secretary of Agriculture, Kim Vanneman. Secretary Vanneman has served as our secretary since January of this year, and it has been a wonderful half year serving under her leadership. Secretary Vanneman and her husband, Clint, own and operate Vanneman Farms, a diversified farming operation located north of Winter, South Dakota. She served as a member of the South Dakota House of Representatives from 2007 to 2013, where she held a seat on the Ag and Natural Resources Committee for all 6 years. She also served previously as a director for Farm Credit Services of America, the Farm Credit Council, Farm Credit Foundations, and FCC Services. Secretary Vanneman and her husband have 3 children and 5, almost 6, grandchildren. Without further ado, please help me welcome Secretary Vanneman to the podium.
Thank you, Maggie. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the 2019 Governor's Ag Summit. We're really excited to be here in Sioux Falls the next couple days hosting this wonderful event. As Maggie mentioned, I'm Kim Vanneman, the Secretary of the South Dakota Department of Agriculture. I know many of you here, but for those of you that don't know me, I grew up on a ranch near Chamberlain, and that's where my passion for agriculture began. And it just continued to grow and has only grown stronger over time. My husband Clint and I, as Maggie said, own and operate a diversified operation at Ideal, South Dakota, and it really is the ideal place to live. Our operation consists of row crops and small grains. We have a commercial beef cow herd and a beef feedlot. In 2009, our farm was recognized as a Century Farm. And we are very, very proud of that recognition and have great hopes for the future of the operation as we are in the midst of transitioning our farm to our children, particularly our son and daughter-in-law. In fact, this spring, my husband and I moved off the farm into winter, and our son and daughter-in-law have moved in to the farmhouse that my husband and I built when we came to the farm. And so we are really looking forward to watching them transition, taking over the management and operation of our farm, but especially the most important thing on the farm is raising your children. And so we'll have that opportunity to see them raise their children where we raised our 3 children. The future of agriculture is dependent on those individuals of the next generation, just like my son and daughter-in-law. It will be up to this next generation to find the innovative ways to improve and grow our industry. I'm really excited to see how they will continue to provide our communities, our country, our world with abundant, safe, nutritious food as well as fiber and fuel. When we started putting together the agenda, we really wanted to focus and put some emphasis on the next generation. That's an area of focus for Governor Noem as well as for myself. I'm really excited to mention that Governor Noem will be here joining us tomorrow morning for our capstone session, where she will be moderating a panel of young and future agriculturalists talking about what the future looks like for them in the agricultural industry. But between now and then, we have a great lineup of speakers covering the challenges and opportunities that we face today and tomorrow. From markets to communicating with the consumers, I hope that you will find this year's conference will be a very informative one. I also hope that you'll take advantage of the networking breaks that we have scheduled throughout the next couple days, as well as the reception that we're having later this afternoon or this evening, and to get a chance to meet new friends, to connect with some that you haven't seen for a while, and make those bonds even stronger that we have across the agricultural industry. You know, and I can't be up here without saying and recognizing this has been a tough year. And it's been a tough year on top of several tough years. It seems like whether it's Mother Nature, the markets, the tariffs, whatever, it seems like agriculture's kind of continually been dealt a pretty tough hand to deal with. But despite this, I know that we are resilient. We always seem to find the ways to address and overcome the challenges that are thrown at us. I have no doubt that we will get through this cycle and these tough times, albeit maybe with a few scars and that, but we will be stronger and ready for the future because of this. But we also have really good reason to be optimistic in agriculture. Agriculture in South Dakota remains incredibly strong. In 2014, the Department of Agriculture commissioned a study to analyze the impact that agriculture has on the economy in South Dakota. They used the 2012 agricultural census data to measure this. So with the data that came out from the 2017 agricultural census, we used that data and updated our numbers. And so we just have some preliminary information that really is kind of hot off the press that I'm going to reveal to you today. So aren't you glad you're all here? In 2014, the agricultural impact in South Dakota was $25.6 billion. I think you've seen that number. We've been using it in a lot of our marketing in that. This economic impact with the new 2017 census data has jumped to $32.5 billion. Isn't that great? Similarly, the number of South Dakotans that are employed in the agricultural industry has gone from 115,000 to 132,000, or 22% of the workforce is in the agricultural industry. I believe much of this growth can be attributed to the diverse agricultural landscape that we have in South Dakota, incorporating both crops and livestock, as well as the increase in processing and value-added agriculture that we have in this great state. Now, this is just a sneak preview and a couple of the numbers, which we will be releasing in the coming weeks. But I am excited about the future of agriculture in South Dakota. Truly, there is opportunity and optimism for the next generation. So before we get started, I too would like to have a shout out and a huge thank you to our sponsors for this summit. Because as Maggie said, without your support and sponsorship, we would not be able to have this conference with no charge. So please join me in thanking Bank West, BNSF, Bayer, Farm Credit Services of America, Farmers Business Network, First Dakota National Bank, First National Bank, Ethanol Producers Association. Thank you so much for your support and involvement. Again, I just want to thank all of you for coming to Summit. I know that it's just been an incredible year and everybody just has a lot going on, but I'm just so appreciative that you have really taken time out of your busy schedule to come here to learn with us, to be able to get into conversations with current and future leaders, all wanting to promote and grow South Dakota agriculture for today and tomorrow. So thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Secretary Vandeman. As producers and businessmen and women, we know that agriculture is constantly a shifting industry with new obstacles every season. It is important to be prepared and ready to adapt and face whatever comes next. Our first panelists will discuss the current state of crop and livestock markets and what we can expect in the future. We're happy to welcome Sue Martin. Sue is the president of Ag and Investment Services Incorporated. She served on the board for the National Futures Association Nominating Committee in 1994 to 1995 and was recently asked back for 2018 to 2020. Sue has more than 30 years of experience in the commodity arena and serves as a guest analyst for several U.S. radio stations and television shows. Mike Pearson is a farmer, broadcaster, and former banker from Grinnell, Iowa. Each month, he keeps over 6,000 listeners informed on agriculture issues as a co-host of the podcast Ag News Daily. Please join me in welcoming Sue Martin and Mike Pearson.
I'm kind of excited to be here today because basically when I look at the markets, we've been in a declining market since 2012, and we've gone 7 years with cheap prices. And basically, if you look at history, it tends to show that 5 to 6 years, 7 years are pushing it, you tend to bottom the markets out and you start to see a change in direction, mainly because cheap prices brings on more demand. There's an old saying that corn farmers love to plant corn. And for a while, this year was thought maybe we were going to have an exception to that. But because of the crop insurance, the superior crop insurance for corn, it's now making us wonder if perhaps there's quite a few bean acres that have been switched over to corn, farmers farming the crop insurance. But when we look at the years that are similar to what we're looking at now, we find that there are similarities of behavior in the marketplace. Similar years would be 1983, although that would be a pick year and was a late planted year. The crop that year yielded 21% less. And then it was 1993, and that was an infamous flooding year, and the yields were 10% less below trend. And then 1995 was the third similar year, and the yields were down 10% below trend. So it leads us to believe, because those were late planted years as well, it leads us to believe that we're looking at a year where yields are not going to be anything comparable to the last 4 or 5 years. And what we're thinking is that there's another year that this year really is following a pattern. That year is 1974. You don't hear very many people talk about it, but that year we had a solar minima. We also had, and of course, currently many of these years are in solar minima that we're comparing to. But also, that year, we had a late planted crop, but we got caught by an early frost freeze. Labor Day, we had the frost, and on the 21st of September, we had a killing freeze. And I remember that year very well because I worked with a company called Hinode at the time. And they had, at the Farm Progress shows, a big tent where they had pig races. And I was going to work at those pig races that day. And I remember the corn being smelling like silage, and the beans were black. And it pretty much encompassed most of the state of Iowa. Well, when, need it closer? Okay. So basically, what we seen was, it was the first time corn prices went to, excuse me, $4 a bushel. Bean prices that fall went to $9.63, $9.56, right in that area. And that created a market that pushed higher into the fall and then fell back. 1995 was or let's go for 1983. 1983, the market put its low in even in 1993 as well. We put our low in around the 14th of June, rallied into about the 9th or so, maybe a little later in July, and we broke prices into September. Then the market turned and rallied in through the fourth quarter. And this year seems to be a little bit like that. Our year has a low in May, May 14th. We have an outside range month, a higher high, and a lower low during the month of May. Then in June, we pushed higher and turned around and came back and closed the month lower. That portended or indicated that we would see a lower monthly low in July, and we've done that. So what are the odds of turning and taking back out June's high in July? Well, that's 2 outside range months within 3 months. That would be pretty unusual, but if it happens, it's extremely bullish. But when I look at the markets, we know that not only has farmers been concerned and analysts concerned, ethanol plants, your commercials, are very concerned about having enough corn this fall. In fact, ethanol plants are so concerned that they're looking to Brazil to buy corn or bring corn into the country. And when the NASS came out in the supply-demand report in June and lowered the yield 10 bushels to the acre down to 166 BPA, we noticed that the price of U.S. corn rallied quite nicely, but South American corn didn't follow as aggressively. And therefore, we priced ourselves a little bit out of the market. Now, Brazil is harvesting corn, and Argentina is too. And the winter crop in Brazil is currently estimated by WASDE at 95 million metric tons. But you have analysts, consulting groups out of Brazil estimating it as high as 101 million metric tons. You have Argentina's crop estimated at 50.5 million metric tons, and that compares to last year at 32 million metric tons. So South America has plenty of corn to export, and so they're going to be competitive with us. In the meantime, it's thought that the U.S. Soybean crop, being as late planted as it is going to have a concern of maybe a yield drop as well. Well, the years of 1990 and 1995 were both late planted years in soybeans. And we found that, or 96, I mean, and we found that in those years, beans tended to be pretty resilient and ended up yielding quite well. So when we look at this year's bean crop, we wonder, because it was very late planted, And we sort of suspect that depending on what the weather does, beans do have a chance. And that keeps the bean market a little bit at bay. But because of the acres that we're looking at in Prevent Plant, of which we could have an estimated 10 million acres of Prevent Plant when it's all said and done, when NASS finishes all their surveys and come out with data in August. It is possible that we have 10 million acres because we've already had $151 million in claims for Prevent Plant, and they estimate that that could reach $1 billion. But let's just say in corn that you take the yield down to 163. NASS is currently at 166. And you take it down to 163, and let's say there's 7.4, 7.3 million Prevent Plant acres. And in the meantime, because we have less corn, we have to lower usage a little bit, so you drop the usage 400 million bushels. You now could be looking at a stocks to usage ratio of about, I want to say 8.3%. That would be your fourth tightest stock to usage ratio for corn since 1973. Let's say you drop it down to 159, and you keep the acres the same at 7.4 million Prevent, and you drop usage again a little bit more. Stocks to usage could be as tight as 6%, and that would be your second tightest since 1960. What would happen if all of a sudden Iowa State's right about the 135 bushel per acre yield potential this year? That would be comparable to the year of 2012. And what would happen if that occurred? Where would our carryout be? Our stocks to usage ratio would probably set new records. Price would have to ration in order to slow the demand up for corn. So we have a setup this year in corn that is very, very critical. And soybeans is one that's yet to be discovered as well. Now, some worry about frost or hot, dry weather, but it may not be either of those that's the biggest concern this year. Corn is bred up for dryness, for drought, not for wetness. And their hybrids carry a trait that was common in the corn back in the 1970 southern corn leaf blight fiasco. And it's called T cytoplasm trait. So you look at the Delta South and look at the rain they've had. Other parts of the country's been pummeled too, but they have really been inundated almost every month this year. And now they have a storm in the Gulf, and it's in the eastern Gulf, but it's to move on west, they think. Depending on how aggressive it gets, it could turn into a tropical storm. It could drop 8 to 10 inches into New Orleans, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia. The Delta South will be hit hard again. Now let's say the rain shuts off and the temperatures heat up. You have a perfect scenario for southern leaf blight to occur again. Soybeans, sudden death syndrome this year. The crops are just getting a good start. And ironically, the crop condition ratings on corn are at the lowest levels in 33 years. So while you drive through the countryside, and I drove up here today, I drove to Okoboji last night, stayed overnight, and then came today. But I noticed, crops don't look too bad. They look good. It's just they're horribly behind. And nowhere's close for pollination. Now, this is on the western side of the Mississippi. What about the eastern side of the Mississippi? It is a disaster. And Michigan is estimated that their corn pollination will occur from the end of July through, or I should say from around the 18th of August to the early part of September. What are their odds of making it? And our corn got in a little late, but pretty timely compared to most. And the corn isn't going to tassel for probably another week and a half. And with all that we've dealt with in corn this year, I suspect we're going to have a situation where the market is going to be very apprehensive of breaking down too easily until they know they have it pollinated, because that accounts for 90% of your yield, for what yield we're going to get this year. And then beans, if you take the years, even though they show more potential or better potential, soybeans are daylight hours, and you get past Labor Day and they start to slow down, but they can add 5 bushels if they catch a rain. Our weather sources are telling us, excuse me, our weather sources are telling us that we're going to see this heat stay with us at least into around the 20th of July. I kind of wonder, they've been about 2 weeks off in their predictions. I wonder if it won't last through most of July, and then we start to turn cool and possibly wet again. If we turn cool, that slows down your corn progression, but it'll help the beans, except beans don't like wet feet. So if you look at beans, they could come in with 3% below trend yield as well. Now I'm going to try this. So do I? It worked. Okay, this is corn foreign production deficit. And this is a chart that I always like to do because it takes the U.S. out of the picture, but it shows us how badly the rest of the world needs our corn. And if you notice, they need it pretty aggressively. It's a record need for quite a few years. So demand for corn should remain good. Another thing that happened in corn in these reports was the fact that the NASS had lowered our usage, and I think they did it in January and in March, maybe April, but they lowered the feed usage on corn. And I thought, now how can that be? They say we didn't have near the death loss in cattle. So we have more cattle, more hogs, and more poultry. How can we not have more feed usage on corn? Well, then in this last report, they kind of shoved that back in. And so in this supply-demand report tomorrow, we expect to see feed usage increased. Exports, that's going to be a little questionable. Exports have really slowed down. And in soybeans, we're wondering if exports aren't a little too high, because if you notice, we only have about a month and a half, little over a month and a half to go before we hit the end of our market year. So exports could be lowered in tomorrow's report. This is corn foreign production deficit, but we pulled China out along with the US. And if you notice, the rest of the world all of a sudden doesn't need us quite as much. If you look at China, China's kind of interesting. One, they're not very truthful in their data. But if you look at China, and they have the fall armyworm. Now, Beijing is on the same longitude, latitude as Chicago, Illinois. Look at Illinois' weather. You don't think southern China hasn't had a lot of rain? And the fall armyworm started, first noticed in January, in the southwest of the country. It has now moved into the northern part of the country, and it's into 20 provinces out of 33 major corn-producing provinces. It's going to be a problem. Their corn need is going to be huge. And then you look at Taiwan. Taiwan has, I think last year, they were estimated to have a meat usage 74.1 kilograms per person or per capita. China is estimated to have per capita usage in pork of 41.1 kilograms. In poultry, 13 kilograms, and in beef and veal, 6.6 kilograms. If China plans to whether you have a tariff trade war or not, they're going to have to up the ante for protein. They're going to need feedstuffs. Their need for feedstuffs will account for basically a need of 37 million more acres of corn production. That's equivalent to the size of England and Wales combined. It's not going to happen in China. They don't have any more ground to deal with. And bean production is supposed to be up, I think, 5.7 million metric tons this year. That's kind of interesting because China's production on beans is not nearly as good as it is in corn and wheat. So they're going to be importing. Ukraine, number 4 exporter in the world, is having some issues with heat. And it's thought that their corn, currently projected by the USDA at 32 million metric tons. But the production a year ago was 35.8 million metric tons. So they're going to have some issues too. And so we'll see what happens because Brazil is expected to plant more bean acres this coming season, this fall. So it's going to be an interesting time. And then you lose number 1 exporter in the world. You lose a major production in the US. Do you realize if we have a 6.6 or a 6% stocks to usage ratio at 159 bushels per acre, what would it be at 135? What's our carryout going to be like? We're decimating these huge carryouts. And the market's going to be very tenuous, and you're going to have very volatile markets in the month of August. This is world corn ending stocks, and the line is stocks percent of usage. The green line is with China in it, and the ending stocks is with China included. But the blue line is our ending stocks as a stock, I should say stocks as a percent of usage without China's data. It was interesting. The ag attaché to China just, I think this last week, estimated Chinese corn stocks at 230 million metric tons. And yet, the USDA is at 250, maybe 254. So we're thinking there may be some room that gets ratcheted down. But the red bars are your ending stocks without China. You can see we have a very interesting situation with China out of the picture. The rest of the world needs corn. Every year, when I start to look at a new year, I start in the fall and I do what we call like numbers of years. It's amazing how they tend to pattern and give you clues as to what your market's going to be like, where the highs and lows will fall. And I only went back to 1959, but I have data that goes back 100 years. And you might say, now come on, we weren't raising corn or beans. Yes, we were. In 1932, you had the first, I think, soybean contract traded on the Chicago Board of Trade. They had to have bean production in the US to start that contract. But in years ending in a 9, you can see May, June, and July tend to be where you cluster a tendency to have your highs. You never know the reason why, it's just a pattern. It's called market patterning. And the lows tend to come in September or November. This year, though, could be a little different. This year, we could have our highs here from June, kill some time. The corn market technically is building what could be a head and shoulders top formation. But I don't see the market collapsing. So maybe we peak here. The close out at the end of July will be very important. If you close higher for the month, you have a low end and you're probably heading higher into fall. This is years where final corn yields were in late planted years. And of course, 2019, we believe our yield is going to be down, but we're looking at other similar years. And it's 2013, we were higher that year in the final, and 2011, we were down 11.5 bushels to the acre. If you look at these years, the years that were higher, and there weren't very many of them, the years that we were higher, the strongest one, we increased the yield by maybe 9.3 bushels to the acre. There was only one that did that. The other years that we went down in production, we seen sharply decreased yields. 22 bushels to the acre in 1993. 1991, there was no May estimate compared to the final, but this is taking from May to the final. Also, in the last 13 years, from the June estimate of acres to the final, we have found that acres declined in 8 of those 13 years. What do you think it's going to do this year? This is years where corn silking progress on July 7th was 8% or lower. Now, I came by this from Reuters, and it was interesting because what I wanted to show was that because we were 8% silking this year as well. But I wanted to show that going back to 1981, it was interesting to see that you would think, okay, the corn crop's really late. What was interesting was many of those years had a high or a low in July, and then would turn and make a rally into the fall. Not all of them. Some of them continued on down from a high in July, but many of them rallied into the fall and through the fourth quarter, November, December. I apologize because I don't know how well you can see these charts, but I felt like I needed to show you these because we have, first off, you'll notice on this one, this is a lead contract of weekly corn. So when, for example, July corn goes off the board, it'll be the September contract on this chart. And it's weekly data, highs and lows. But you can see we've had a huge base in time. There's an old theory called wall-to-wall that you take from the left side of when you proceeded into that base and the right side, that can give you your projection of how high you go when the market ultimately moves. Well, 135 bushel per acre yield this year, if that was to happen like Iowa State said, and also University of Illinois kind of followed up on that data as well. Scott Irwin is an economist there. And it was interesting because the last time we had 135 was in 2012. Corn went to $8.49 a bushel. Now, can corn do that again? I'm not going to say it can't, but I'm thinking when you look at these charts, there's this gap in space. Let me see if I can get my pointer here. See this gap right in here and over here? That gap is a huge gap. It doesn't look so huge on that chart, but it is huge. It's massive. It goes from 549 to, I believe, 684. That is probably the largest gap I've ever seen in any corn market in history. And I have to tell you, I've been in this business longer than 30 years. I've been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of markets. And this gap, if nothing else, will be partially filled, and I suspect by next July. Now, basis levels have firmed up, and especially in the eastern corn belt, and it's because of the fact that there's no corn moving. And I suspect they keep saying there's a lot of corn in farmers' hands. We'll find that out in August. Farmers will be opting to move that corn in August, especially if they made pollination, or they may elect to sell the crop off the combine and keep the old crop in the bin because it's better quality. But we'll find out in August. And I'm starting to wonder, do we really have as much corn in farmers' hands as they're saying we do? It's not moving. And they've been bids in the eastern corn belts up over $5. What a gift if they still have it. This is September corn weekly communication or continuation. And again, you can see we have a gap on that chart. The continuous weekly chart has one. The July contract has one. September corn and December corn each have one as well. And so these are the contracts that are going to be more enthusiastic. And I kind of wonder about next year, the July contract, I kind of wonder if basis isn't going to be huge and inverted, and it will especially be so if we have a really drastically reduced crop. This is December corn, weekly continuation likewise. And again, you can see I put a red line across the chart to show all the resistances, which, by the way, extended back in time is giving support. And so old supports become resistance. And we're passing through that. We pinched through it, not majorly, but a little bit. This is soybean foreign production deficit. And assuming, again, we took the US out of the picture to see just how bad the rest of the world needs us. And of course, not as bad as 2 years ago, but more so than last year. Now keep in mind, Brazil and Argentina's data is in this chart. So this is even with our competitor in the data. They still need us. This is world soybean ending stocks with a stocks to usage ratio. Now, again, the green line is with China in, and the black bars are global supplies. They're thinking tomorrow in the report that world stocks on soybeans will come out around 109.2 million metric tons, which is down about from 112.348 of last month. So they're looking for a reduction in ending stocks for soybeans. And with China out of the picture, the ending stocks in red are reduced, but still fairly high. So that's why beans are struggling, regardless of a trade war. I thought it was interesting, and I talked about this on Market to Market the last time I was on the show, was that in March and May, CNGOIC, which is state-owned enterprise for China, has a presence in Chicago, and they're called CNGOIC International Grains. Both months of delivery, they took over 90%, if not 95% of the deliveries. All of a sudden this month, they're absent. And I think that's rather interesting because for 2 months of deliveries, they took them, and now, and that's not your normal orthodox way that they would do it. Now, they're absent, and it makes me wonder if they're still not present, but taking deliveries through other sources. For soybeans, years ending in a 9 happen to be very similar, years of May, June, and July. But if you look, September kind of comes in there too, as well as November. This is a very critical year, and there's talk that this year we could see an early frost freeze. So if we see an early frost freeze this year, we have several weather sources that are talking this. One of them's World Weather, Drew Lerner, and the other one is out of South America, and he's out of Uruguay, and has tended to be pretty accurate. So I think that it's going to be very interesting to see if they're correct in what they're saying. Another one that's talking it is Mike Tenura with T-Storm out of Chicago. With that, that's my presentation, and I appreciate this opportunity to have been here today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sue. As always, fantastic data. I really appreciate her insight and her input. And I knew that Sue would do a really good job getting us the details of what's going on in the markets. Excuse me. So I want to take a step back a little bit. I want to pull us out of the Chicago Board of Trade, and I want to put us squarely in the world. What is happening globally in agriculture that is going to have an impact and drive our industry over the next year? See if I can make this thing work. Am I going backwards? Here's the agenda for today's event. It's going to be fantastic. It is going to be fantastic. We'll get this figured out. But I want to look at really the situation we're in today. Sue hit the nail on the head. I think all of us who are involved in agriculture know this, but in 2019, the overriding concern we are facing is uncertainty. We are literally looking at uncertain information all over the place. We've got weather uncertainty. I know South Dakota has dealt with their fair share of weather here over the past 6 months. We've got trade uncertainty. We've got concerns with regard to who is going to be our trading partners, who can we trust on the international world, and of course we've got ongoing uncertainty with regard to the federal government. We've got ongoing uncertainty on issues that really we should be fairly certain about. Sue alluded to it in her talk a little bit, but USDA numbers. We saw the planted numbers come in about a week ago, and according to USDA, we planted 91.7 million acres of corn. That was a number far higher than any analyst guesses, or at least any that I was familiar with, Sue. I don't think anybody guessed we planted that many acres of corn. We don't trust that number. We're uncertain about what's happening there at the USDA. Now, they're going to resurvey. We're going to have a better handle on what's going on. We also have economic uncertainty, big picture stuff. We've got a lot of really positive things working in the broader economy. Earlier today, S&P 500 topped 3,000 points for the first time in history. And yet, we've got a Federal Reserve that is considering lowering interest rates. It's a lot of mixed signals. So I want to kind of dig into those a little bit. We've got so much going on and a little bit of time to do it, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for your questions for both Sue and I, and we can get in really deep with the best information that we have available. First of all, weather. What is going to happen this year with regard to weather? I don't know. I'm not a meteorologist. At the end of the day, I don't think any of us anticipated this spring was the spring we were going to have when we started talking about this being an El Nino year. Weather has been absolutely nuts. Well, for a while, but certainly for the past 6 months. I had the chance to fly into Sioux Falls this morning, and I flew out of Chicago. And skies were clear. Ordinarily, July 10th, flying over central, northern Chicago, Iowa, parts of southern Minnesota into South Dakota, it is a lush carpet of green. It's like straight out of a 1970s house with green shag carpeting. That's what it looks like usually. Not this year. I was absolutely stunned crossing some of the highest production corn and soybean ground in the world to see still huge gaps in planted acres, huge brown spots. Even in the fields that were planted, you could see, massive acre-sized ponding still in existence on July 10th. That is nuts. Sue mentioned the raining down in the Delta. The Delta, of course, is where the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers all come together south of Cairo, Illinois, and pushes down on into Mississippi, and it's catastrophic. The Eastern Corn Belt, as Sue mentioned, is terrible. Corn bids for ethanol plants and for livestock producers are off the charts for this time of the year. A friend of mine is a cattle feeder over in Northwest Ohio, kind of in the epicenter of the prevent plant catastrophe this year. And he said if he was going to try to buy corn today, in order to compete with some poultry processors and some ethanol plants, he would have to bid $1.15 over the board. That was going to be his basis in Northwest Ohio. It's nuts. And we've got flooding continuing on the Mississippi River. Barges are not moving as much as we need to get this corn away from the places that do have it and get it out to our export customers. Weather is going to be a massive story for the remainder of this year. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in it, as there always is with regard to weather, but we're seeing the market catch its breath. Sue mentioned we're putting in a potential head and shoulders formation. That's a bearish formation on the price charts because it looks like, oh, we peaked here a couple weeks ago, and we kind of fell back, and now what does it look like going forward? We're waiting to get some confirmation on the weather. We're waiting to get some confirmation on, okay, how many acres did get planted? USDA is going to resurvey. They are going to have those numbers to us in August. We are waiting to hear what the weather begins to look like as we get a little closer to pollination, which is, as Sue mentioned, delayed substantially in 2019. I want to take a look and jump into just a little bit of some of the issues out of DC. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on them. We're very lucky tonight to have Mr. Steve Censky coming in from DC to address us in the crowd, and I'm sure he will have a lot more inside baseball information as to what all is happening in DC. But these three factors are going to move markets. They are going to shape producers' decisions on the farm. The first is the second round of MFP payments. This is the Market Facilitation Program that was enacted in 2018 to help counteract the price losses caused by the trade war and China stepping out of the soybean market and just kind of the general collective sigh that happened in all the commodity markets when this trade war kicked off. It was announced just a few months ago, in fact, during planting season, that we are going to get a round two. There is going to be more effectively direct payments from the government tied to this trade war. We still don't know all the details. We don't exactly know how much we're going to get paid. We don't really know what it is going to be, the payment's going to be based upon. We do know it's going to be 3 separate payments. The first one is expected to come in August. It's going to be based on a per county payout scheme. So there's a bunch of bean counters in DC who are totaling up the economic damage to every county. And then if you farm in those counties, you're going to get a check roughly equivalent, expectedly, to what you lost due to the economic damage. How are they going to do that? How is that going to happen? I mean, they got to have a much more powerful calculator than I got at home, because I cannot make those numbers make sense. But that's the idea behind it. We're going to get this first payment in August. We're going to get 2 more payments, if needed, as we go throughout the remainder of the 1920 marketing season. Lenders last year. Do we have any lenders in the crowd? Farm lenders in particular? You can probably raise your hands. There's no need to be shy. All right, we got one. She was brave too. All right. All right. I need to see you folks afterwards. I got to talk about a new operating note. No, we've got lenders last year. We're very excited with the MFP payment. That was a nice chunk of change that just came in. It is expected we are going to see a similar chunk of change coming through this year. The second federal issue that is going to be garnering headlines as we move throughout 2019, 2020, 2021, 22, all the way up through, however long, we're going to be talking trade. We are in a new environment when it comes to the public's perception of international trade. Since the end of World War II, the United States has been adamantly free trade. We have had some of the lowest tariffs of any country in the world. We guaranteed free trade with the use of our extremely effective military service people, and we flourished. And the U.S., the public, was broadly in favor of free trade. That's changing. We see this especially in our president, President Trump. He has been very, very vocal about how free trade has hurt especially the American worker. And that idea has really caught on and taken root. Recent surveys have shown that support for free trade is at its lowest level in recorded, or since these polls have been recorded, for about the past 50 years in the American public. This matters to us in agriculture, because in agriculture, we are really, really good at what we do. We grow corn, we grow wheat, we grow pulses, we grow livestock. We do everything better than anybody else in the world. And we have a population of about 317 million people in this country. We need trade. We need to be shipping our goods off of our shores. We just can't consume enough grains in particular in the U.S. to justify prices being at a level that supports American agriculture. Because to be as good as we are requires substantial investments in technology, in machinery, in knowledge, and education. All of these things require dollars, so we need to have grain prices be above break even. And without international trade, we can't get there. So agriculture is going to have to find a way that we can fit our industry into this changing conversation on trade. Because we've had two instances in history where countries that we had traded with suddenly backed out of the market. The first was the Russian grain embargo under Jimmy Carter, entered us into the 1980s commodity market crisis and the farm crisis. One of the factors, perhaps a leading factor. Now we're looking at something similar with regard to China. Maybe we put all of our eggs in one basket in building China up as an export customer for soybeans. Maybe there are some things we can do to diversify our pool of purchasers. But this is a conversation that we are going to have as an industry, and it's something that on our individual farm level, we're going to have these conversations at church, at work, at the coffee shop, because we need trade in ag. We are not an industry that will survive without it in the manner to which we've become accustomed. We can survive, but if we continue to see low prices, if we continue to see the lack of trading opportunities, we will see consolidation at the farm level. We will continue to see folks really try to maximize economies of scale to get those break-even costs down. Trade is vital for agriculture, and this is a new conversation we're having. And then finally, divided government. We've got Republicans in control of the White House, of course, and the Senate, Democrats in control of the House of Representatives. This just creates challenges in getting stuff done in D.C. I'm guessing Mr. Sensky will have some thoughts on how things are going in D.C., but I think of the most prominent example we have of how this can be detrimental to rural America with the disaster bill that was passed finally by Congress in response to the devastating flooding across Nebraska, parts of South Dakota, and western Iowa. It took months to get that bill through. They'd have an agreement with most of the people, and then they'd throw it out, and everybody, pee on it. It was terrible. Finally, it got done, but it took a really, really long time. We are going to see things in D.C., I think, especially if they have to go through Congress, take more time than we are used to seeing in ag. But uncertainty isn't always a bad thing. Uncertainty can create opportunities. Let's look at the broader economy. As I mentioned, S&P 500 went over 3,000 points earlier today. Incredible, incredible. Unemployment, up a little bit as we get through to this summer, up at I think 3.7 or 3.8% now. Still incredibly low unemployment rates. Home values People's homes are rising in price. We're seeing consumers feel wealthier. This opens some pretty exciting doors in the ag industry. When people have more cash, they're willing to spend it a little bit differently. DTN, just on Monday, had a fantastic article. They were looking at changing preferences in the beef industry. And the third most expensive cut on a steer today is the brisket. Historically a garbage cut, which is why we barbecued it. Now it's the third most expensive. Consumers are going to barbecue joints. Barbecue prices are nuts. If you go into a city, they're insane, and demand has skyrocketed and the brisket has shot up in value. It's now competing with the rib. This is interesting, to say the least. But it comes on the heels of some other very interesting news, which is that total beef production is continuing to climb. And I'm highlighting beef here because beef is the most expensive protein. When you go out to celebrate, you do it with a steak, not a chicken breast, right? So beef is what you buy when you got a little extra cash in your pocket. And consumers are buying it. We're seeing the American consumer make the trip to the grocery store and choose to buy beef. And this is happening for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, they are feeling wealthier. Obviously, there is just extra cash flowing around and we're going to spend it on something. We're going to treat ourselves. But it's also because we've changed the way we're marketing meat, particularly at the retail level in the grocery store. 5 years ago, if you went into a meat counter at a grocery store, how were you buying meat? By the pound, right? $8.99 a pound for a ribeye. If you go into a grocery store today, how are you buying cuts of meat? Per piece. This is genius marketing. I had the chance, I went into our local Hy-Vee grocery store in Grinnell, Iowa, here just a couple weeks ago. I wanted some ribeyes. I was out of my freezer beef, so I'm going to go spend some cash. 8-ounce ribeyes, which to my mind, that's a sandwich cut ribeye, but whatever. I needed some ribeyes. 8 ounce. I look at the little sign in the meat case, $9.99. All right, that's a little higher than I'd like to pay for ribeye, $9.99 a pound. It'll work. I'll buy it. No, $9.99 a piece for an 8-ounce ribeye. We're selling ribeyes for $20 a pound in rural Iowa. That's genius. We're adding value to the supply chain, and the great news is consumers are paying for it. I think a lot of times, those of us who work in agriculture, we work in rural America, we get used to what we see. We get used to always having beef in our freezer. We get used to always having pork in the freezer. We get used to having the people we can call on, getting a deal on some high-quality protein. When you're in a city, when you're in an urban environment, you do not have those choices. And people in urban environments are very excited about high-quality protein. This was driven home to me a few months back. I had the chance to travel to Chicago, and I was working with a company that actually I'm now working for, the Zahner Group in Chicago, and they'd been advertising on our podcast since we got started. They've been great people. So I called up Matt Zahner, and I said, Matt, I want to thank you for you taking a risk and advertising with us. I want to take you and Ted Seifert out to dinner. Any place you choose, I'll get the check. I learned an important lesson that day. Never let somebody pick the restaurant when they know you're paying for it. So they picked the restaurant. We picked a steakhouse, obviously. RPM Steakhouse in downtown Chicago. It's owned by the first guy who was the apprentice on The Apprentice under Donald Trump. I forget his name now. But he owns it. It's a very, very nice restaurant. The restaurant itself is probably about the size of this half of the room. Huge. Big bar along one side. We got over, this was in December. So we got over there. It was a Tuesday night in December. It's sleeting, it's that miserable, windy, dark December evening. We roll into this restaurant at about 5:30 at night. It's a steak place. I love steak. I'm excited to eat here. The maitre d' is very friendly, gets us our menus. He's grinning ear to ear, and he sits us down at a nice table. And I opened the menu, and I could see why he was so excited. Steaks at RPM Steakhouse, and I tell, if you get the chance to go, go. It's just weird to see this on paper. The cheapest steak was $62. Steaks ranged in price from the value $62 option up to $245 for a porterhouse for two. So I guess you're kind of buying in bulk with that option. I took a look at that menu and immediately excused myself to go to the bathroom and get my credit card limit up so I could afford to pay for this meal. This was nuts to me. But we all sat, we ordered. You know, it's a fancy steakhouse, so they don't include your sides. You've got to pay extra for those. So we get our steaks, and of course we get 4 sprigs of asparagus for $19 and a little tub of mashed potatoes for $37 and all of this stuff. A couple beverages, and we're there a few hours. Waiter brings me the bill, moment I'd been dreading. $680 for 4 people to eat. All right. No big deal. It's a corporate restaurant. That's people go there when they have expense accounts, and they're used to that. What blew me away, other than the price, and that's before the tip, mind you, was we got up to leave at about 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, miserable weather. Nothing's going on in Chicago. There's no sporting event, there's no big concert, there's no reason for people to be outside of their homes. But at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, that restaurant, the size of this room, was packed. Every table was full. And I got to imagine, you don't go to a place like that for the chicken breast. You go for the steak. So when we see numbers like this, and the cattle kill has continued at an incredible pace all summer long. We're seeing packers today start to bid up the market a little bit because farmers are finally be able to get some work done. They need to pull some cattle out of the countryside. This is happening because we have extra cash in this country. Extra cash opens up a couple other opportunities as well. Niche products, organic, locally produced, non-GMO, what else do we have on there? Organic, this is just, we're looking at organic numbers here. All of these things have the potential to create value for growers. There are a lot of additional work on the production side, and from somebody with my background, growing up in conventional agriculture, utilizing all the technologies we have available today, I look at organic production and I scoff. Why would you throw your money away on something? It's the exact same. It's just food. Why would you spend more to get the same thing that you can get conventionally produced? What it is people spending money to align with their values. We are such a rich country today that we've got disposable income that we can spend in a way makes us feel good. And some consumers choose to do that with niche products, whether it's organic or locally grown or non-GMO or whatever, because they have those dollars. And I had to bring myself back a little bit and go, okay, this is a great opportunity. Yes, it's mainly a marketing opportunity, but it's a marketing opportunity. And there's real dollars in it. And then I kind of had to look at myself a little bit and go, okay, in what areas of my life do I spend money on something that others might consider wasteful? Who here has a Yeti cooler? Anybody with a Yeti cooler? I own several. I love Yeti coolers. Guess what? Buying a Yeti cooler is really stupid. You're spending $400 on a box to hold a $1 bag of ice. You could buy a lot of ice for $400 and put in that old Coleman. But the Yeti appeals to us in different ways. I like it. I like sailing. So I've got a Yeti cooler that fits on my little sailboat and keeps my sodas warm all day long. Or not warm, the other one, cold all day long. And I like that when I get back to my truck, and I get my cooler out of my boat, it's a Yeti. I'm keeping up with the Joneses. Niche crops are just like that. They're a tremendous opportunity out there. When agriculture is considering how can we add to our bottom line in troubled times. And 2019, we're seeing a rally. We're seeing prices, as Sue mentioned, we haven't seen in quite a little while. We're not in dire straits quite yet. But for producers who are struggling to produce at break even, what are some other options? Look at doing something like this. The tools we have available today with the internet, in particular with our smartphones, we can market our specialty crops to anybody around the country. And I guarantee to you right now, there is a man or woman in San Francisco who will spend $34 a pound on pork from a pig that you've whispered your dreams to. I don't know why they'll do it, but I guarantee they're there. And if a farmer in South Dakota can find that guy and build that market, he's on Easy Street. These are the opportunities that are coming. A lot of times when we get involved in agriculture and we start looking around at the world around us, we don't see enough changing. And in fact, we see some things that are frustrating, particularly prices in the market. Don't take the price. Make your own price. Sell a $62 sirloin. We can do that in ag. We have those opportunities with us today. I don't want to spend a lot more time on trade. We've kind of hit it pretty well. But just to highlight exactly what happened this past year when we got into this trade tiff with China. They stepped out of the market almost completely all winter long. Now, since then, they've stepped back in. They have promised to make some purchases. There was a couple reports here about 3 weeks ago that now they're looking to actually delay those shipments. So we don't really know if their commitments they've made they're actually going to stick to, which is something that China has done for a long time. And we saw that hit the market, and it deflated all of the ag commodities because all of a sudden, we couldn't trust the ground that we were standing on. We saw things get uncertain. And when it's bearish uncertainty, the market responds by pulling a little premium out of the price levels. So that's what we saw happen with trade. Now, we've got a bigger question going on in China right now. Sue touched on it, and it's huge, and that's African swine fever. China was going to be scaling back purchases of soybeans this year regardless, just because their hog herd is dying. When we look out long term, are we going to get a trade deal done with China? I don't think so, not under a Trump administration. And I think this for several reasons. One, I think President Trump genuinely believes that China has stolen from us and that they should be punished and they should repent and change their ways. And I genuinely believe that China's never going to admit any such thing or change its ways. So I think those two are going to butt heads. I don't think we will have any type of trade agreement under this administration. But African swine fever could be a much longer term impact on American soybean demand in Asia, not just China, but all of Southeast Asia. There are reports now, and Sue mentioned we can't always trust the Chinese government's numbers, and that is seeming to be especially true with African swine fever. According to the Chinese government, about a quarter of their breeding stock has been infected or at risk of infection. According to vets and drug suppliers, pharmaceutical suppliers, I should say, not drug dealers, it's a whole different kind of market right there. But pharmaceutical suppliers and veterinarians in China, based on what they've seen on the ground, their belief is 50% of China's breeding stock is dead or dying today. We're seeing African swine fever spread into Vietnam. It's spreading farther south. It's now in North Korea. Their one pig has African swine fever. It's a tough situation, and there's no cure, there's no vaccine. Yet, reportedly, there's a company in Vietnam that has worked out some kind of magic pill, but they haven't showed it to anybody yet, so we don't know. There is no cure. The last time African swine fever was big, it was on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain. And it took their hog herds 60 years to eradicate the disease. If ASF does lodge itself in China and we can't find a cure or a vaccine, we could see Chinese pork production down substantially for decades. Now, as Sue mentioned, the Chinese consume lots of pork. They're gonna find a way to get those animals. They're probably not anytime soon going to buy their pork from us here in the United States. We use ractopamine, commonly called Paylean, in about 80% of our pork diets, and China won't allow it. But they will certainly look at going to Argentina, to Brazil, putting up their own hog units, finding ways around it. How are we going to get them to be our bean customers longer term? I don't have an answer to it. But African swine fever has me genuinely concerned about soybean exports to Asia going forward, because Asian countries have been quickly becoming really good export partners of ours. We are almost at the time to take some questions. And I left this kind of quick, kind of vague, because at the end of the day, Sue Martin and I both love to come up to South Dakota, and we want to hear from you guys. And I'm not very smart, but I have the chance to work with a lot of really smart people, and I would love to share with you what they've shared with me. So with that, Maggie, should we open it up for questions? All right, do you want the microphone? All right, you can call it.
Sounds good. Like you said, we're going to now open it up for questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and we have Greg and Tom running around with microphones, and they will catch you. And if you're watching online, don't be afraid to tweet at SD Agriculture using the hashtag SDAgSummit. So do we have any questions?
Hey, hi. Is that on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm just curious. I have a younger brother that grows hemp in Minnesota, another brother that grows hemp in Wisconsin for CBD oil. Are there that many acres being planted for CBD and hemp throughout the United States, relative, or, you know, in South Dakota we're not, but just curious what's out there.
Do you know hemp acreage numbers, Sue, offhand?
Say it again.
Do you know hemp acreage numbers?
No, I don't. I know that it's been growing, because even around Fort Dodge, Iowa, we have hemp being grown.
Really?
Yes, and it's thought that it's a coming market that farmers can diversify into.
Yeah, and I guess I would say we're really just figuring out what the demand is. For years, hemp was grown in basements and it wasn't really reported by the USDA. Now it's real hemp, and CBD oil is huge. We're still wondering if we can redevelop the rope market. Hemp clothing, there should be enough of a consumer out there to demand it, but how long is it gonna take to get that production back into existence? Because we haven't had hemp in 70 years, 80 years in this country, so we've got to rebuild all of those industries from scratch. I think my personal take is with hemp, we're gonna see a big rush into it this year, like we're already seeing, probably next year, and then I think it's gonna weed itself out for a couple of years. I think there's gonna be a gold mine land grab, and I hate to say this, but I think there are gonna be growers who get burned just because there isn't, you can't haul it to the co-op, there isn't a market that we have established quite yet, but over the next 10 years, it'll come back and it is definitely a way to diversify, and it's a crazy crop. Has anybody out here seen hemp in the field? Really? Minnesota, North Dakota, I mean, other places? Where? Oh, the Netherlands. Oh, okay. All right. Near Amsterdam, right? Yeah. That's a different market. Yeah. Great question. 78, so tripling in acres in a year. That seems like a market that's going to flood. That's my take. I don't know.
Must be Denver. Any other questions?
Graham Shuking is my name, Lake Preston, South Dakota. I'm a hardcore dairy farmer, and I'm missing the dairy cream here at the coffee table, so that's already the start for the Ag Summit to work on for next year. The corn usage, according to the stocks, when the corn price will rally this fall probably, and we are hitting $8 or $9 a bushel, we saw that the rest of the world needs our corn, but then the demand slows down considerably. We saw it in 2012, and I think that will happen again because they're going to look for other sources of energy then instead of it. So I hope you agree that philosophy. So probably corn will not rally all the way up to $8 or $9. Is that correct?
I don't know if it'll do that.
Right. Well, I think that's the answer.
I have to agree. I don't know as if I would believe under the current environment that we're in, even if if corn does what I think, basically what I'm thinking is we're going to go into those gap areas and try to fill, if not all of it, I think we're going to fill a portion of those gaps that have been sitting there since 2013. And that's kind of what I think is going to happen between now and July of next year. Certainly with what's going on, I would think we will see a lot of corn acres next year. And then you look at South America, Argentina, and you might see an increase in acres there at the expense of wheat. Beans, you look at the harvest in wheat is 47% harvested as of last Sunday, and 47% harvested in hard red winter wheat, and you're not, I mean, there's a lot of farmers that normally would double crop off of that wheat. There's some that'll still try it because of all the moisture that they have, but it's going to get late for those beans to go in. So I'm thinking it's going to be interesting. Corn acres, I think, will decline, but maybe not as drastically because of the bean acres. Back in June, Mike and I both were at the Iowa Women's Landowners Association convention. And when we spoke, late in the afternoon, there was a panel, and there was a farmer that sat next to me, and he made a comment. He said, you know, I don't think corn acres are going to drop like everybody thinks. And I said, why? And he said, well, he said, I'm amazed farmers are still planting corn, and a lot of it. And I know when I drove from Webster City, Clarion, Iowa, which is north central Iowa, up to Okoboji, and then, of course, granted, you get the interstate view, but there's a lot more corn acre fields out there than there are beans. And what was interesting was, then I talked to a client out of Minnesota, and he's southern Minnesota, and he has land just north of the cities as well. And he was driving up there, and he said, Sue, I can't believe it. These guys are still planting corn. And that was in late June. So I have a feeling we're going to see more corn acres than what we originally thought. Still, there's some prevent plant. But I think you're robbing bean acres to go to corn, and they're farming the crop insurance. There's one little thing I want to say that I noticed on your presentation. The S&P. You went over 3,000 on the Dow today. Well, it's interesting because the S&P has a wave 5 count that's up around 3,300 or 33,000. And you're not super far from that. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Sue, for people that aren't familiar with Elliott waves and waves, what is a wave 5? Why does it matter?
Wave 5s are extremely rare. You don't see them very often. The last wave 5 that I can really recall was in 2016 when the cattle market was in the dumpster and it put a bottom in December. And we turned, and of course wave 5s, you just like I say, they're so rare that by the time you get there, the market is so distressed if it's in a down, and if it's in an up, which boy, you see them even more rare in up markets, they're so euphoric. And that's when everybody's getting on board either direction, and you want to reverse. You want to be finding the door and stepping away. So I just thought it was interesting because the stock market with lower interest rates certainly does help drive the stock market. But we'll see what happens.
And just to pick up a little bit, the bigger concern I see as I've been out talking to dairy producers, mainly in the eastern belt, Wisconsin and Michigan, and cattle producers, is just the forage, the quality forage shortage that is coming this fall. We will be awash in cut cover crop acres after September 1, or prevent plant acres after September 1st. We're gonna have all kinds of every Tom, Dick, and Harry going out there and rolling up some sorghum Sudan grass or some, trying to make rilage or something. But how are we going to be sitting with quality forage? And the guys I've talked to in Wisconsin, they're very, very nervous, the dairy producers especially, because we don't know what the quality of this corn crop is going to be. Tonnage looks like it might be there in some parts of the state that got it in okay, but where are we going to be sourcing high-quality feeds from for those really high-value animals, particularly dairy? That's going to be a big question this year, and I don't have the answer to it. I'm still just really trying to figure out the scope of the problem, and I think they are as well. But hats off to you. I don't envy dairy farmers one bit. You people work way harder than I would ever choose to. Thank you. Keep me supplied with ice cream and full-fat milk. That's what America needs more of, Sue. I'm going to make America great again. We do it with whole milk.
One thing I want to say is there is this attitude or thought process that we'll see with China because of African swine fever, a sharp reduction in feed usage. Keep in mind, they have 1.4 billion people. You're seeing riots in Hong Kong, I think it is, and they're really concerned. President Xi is very concerned about this moving into Shanghai and Beijing, and so he's going to be trying to put that to rest. Keep in mind, hungry people fight. No matter what they're going to do, is very capable of on-time delivery, and we deliver good products. They know our weather every bit as well as we know it, and they're watching very intensely because they're already, the government's trying to get the farmer or the producers to repop, to start back. And some of them are a little apprehensive for fear they go back through another financial distress. So they're going to have to fill that void. Now, interestingly, out of the US, if you look at our cold storage on pork, the supplies aren't that burdensome for all the numbers we have. Yeah, we could be eating our way through it domestically, and immigration's a big thing because when you have immigration moving through Europe and maybe 1 million people a year, and then you've got immigration trying to come into the US, what do these people eat? Meat. And that is also part of what I think is driving our meat industry, our beef prices. They eat pork and they eat beef, and they eat hamburger a lot. So that is good for us, but when you look at China, protein, aquaculture, they're already expanding aquaculture, even in some of the previous hog facilities. And then you've got poultry, and you look at the pork and beef, and they're already trying to expand in that. I have a funny feeling our cold storage is lower than what it should be for all the numbers we've got, because I think Smithfield is sending out half carcasses, and it's not being counted the way it should be. I think we've got pork leaving our shores and going to China. And if it's going into, just like CNGOIC, International Grain, they're a state-owned agency. Therefore, because they're a state-owned agency, they don't pay the tariffs. So, because they're government-owned. And I just think that as China makes this push to keep trying to keep pace and get more protein grown, not to mention they're also going to be pulling from other countries, which are going to expand to do it. I think that feedstuff's more of a bright spot for the rest of us that supply.
I hope so. Yeah.
I think so too. But I'm an optimist, so, you know.
Oh, shoot. I had a point. Let's take another question, and mine will come back to that. I don't remember what I was going to say.
It's like when I leave a room.
Right.
If I go back and, because I can't remember why I went there, I go back, start over, I can remember.
Yeah.
My question is on African swine fever and its impact. What if it hits the United States? Talk about the ripple effect there.
Oh, what happens if ASF hits the U.S.? Sue, do you want to jump on this one first?
Sure.
All right.
Well, for one thing, the U.S. is already being very progressive on planning for it. They're in, because if you look, you don't have it in Mexico, you don't have it in the U.S., you don't have it in Canada, so we've been very blessed. And you would think it would be in Mexico or Central America, and they don't have it. Now, Brazil has had it turn up on the coast in a wild boar, but basically, they don't really have it much either. So the U.S. is already working on it, and I think that because we're going to be so progressive, I think that it'll be detrimental to us, no doubt, because our prices are going to fall. But the bottom line is, you still have to eat. People worldwide have to eat. And the Asians are very, especially not so much maybe the Chinese, as much as the Vietnamese, the Mongolians, the North Koreans, they will eat the meat. They're going to eat their way through it. The problem is, I think you have to destroy it. And African swine fever virus lives on clothing, lives on grass, lives in the soil. That's why it's so tough to get rid of. But China's making extra efforts. As of July 1st, every warehouse has to test for any pork they have in their warehouse, and it's going to be destroyed. And my understanding is, because it lives in soil, the U.S. will not put it in, like burn it and bury it. What they will do is put it in like a smoldering house type of a thing where they just bake it and disintegrate it that way. China's also, as of July 1st, every hog that goes through their slaughterhouses, and they have 10,000 of them, every hog that goes through has to be tested. And if one shows up with it, all animals in that facility are put down and culled. And then they go through a 48-hour cleansing process. And the warehouses are the same way. That is why our pork prices have been in the dumpster, because China's prices were falling. They were taking and moving pork out of those warehouses, knowing full well that by the 1st of July, they could lose a lot of money on product they had in their warehouse if one part of it showed up with the virus. So I think they're making progressive moves. Also, did you realize a lot of our medications that we get for swine actually does come from China?
And a lot of minerals.
Yes. And what's interesting is this is the year of the pig for the Chinese. Isn't that rather fitting?
Just to kind of build on what Sue was saying with regard to how the U.S. is going to respond, the industry, as she mentioned, very progressive. We've already done, I think it's no longer preliminary, we have an agreement in place with Canada. So if ASF were to show up in the U.S. or in Canada, they've already got the country divided up into regions. So rather than Canada saying, U.S. has ASF, we're done importing any pork from the U.S., they'll just target the specific region in which it was found. So that should mitigate some, at least cross-border disruptions. The price is the major question. And so just on Monday, I had the chance to sit down with a friend of mine who has been a long-time cattle and hog trader at the CME. And we were solving world problems, as one does on a Monday evening with ethanol. And it's bourbon. That's what I'm talking about. Non-denatured ethanol. And so the topic of ASF came up. And what happens if we have a pig break on our shores? My first thought, I think because it was a formative memory for me, was the cow that stole Christmas, the BSE cow in 2003. Markets limit down for 3 or 4 days right after. There was a catastrophe. And so that's what I said. I said, I imagine we would see prices collapse because we're going to see demand disappear. And my buddy said, no, Mike, because we've been talking about mad cow disease. Sounds terrible. Nobody wanted to eat a cow that could have had mad cow disease. People can get bovine spongiform encephalopathy. I studied history in college. I'm not good at medical words. BSE. That's not the case with ASF. Humans, we can't get it. You could go out there, you can find a pig literally on door's death with African swine fever. You can eat that whole sucker and you're going to be just fine. So there is a difference in how humans, how Americans might respond if it were to come to our shores. His take was we would see prices skyrocket, similar to what we saw happen with poultry and eggs when avian influenza came through. We've got to liquidate all these herds. We've got to dispose of the meat. It can't go into the market, or we're not going to let it go into the market. So we're going to see supply constrict. Demand, his thought is, going to stay strong. People love pork loins, and they know they can't get African swine fever, so they're going to keep wanting to buy. You know, and he thinks hogs go back and they take out their 2013 high of 132 or 133 right in there. So I don't know which way people are going to respond. I think it's a fascinating question, and I really hope for our sake as folks in the ag industry that we never have to figure out how we're going to respond, because if we can keep African swine fever off our shores until a vaccine or a cure is found, that's the best situation without a doubt.
You know, one more thing about that. If you look at the U.S., we have efficient producers. You know, we don't have many that now have just a mom and pop little backyard type thing. China has a lot of producers. Over half of their producers producing hogs is the mom and pop that have maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 hogs, and that's it. Unfortunately, the thing about China is you've got these underground packing houses that will slaughter anything. I don't care if it's on its last breath, they'll slaughter it and turn around and sell the meat at these wet markets. And so that's the problem China has, is that their efficiency and their level of product isn't that great. They're still trying to get their arms around that. And there's just so much under market, black market product.
Do we have any other questions? We've got time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Great. Can we talk about cattle for a little bit?
Absolutely.
All right. So with all of these things going on, you mentioned beef demand a couple of times, and those $20 a pound ribeyes really aren't trickling back to the ranch.
They're not.
So with all of this other stuff going on, what's going to happen to the 1.5 million feeder cattle that we're going to try to market this fall out of South Dakota?
I'm very excited about the beef market. A lot of potential there for the packer. The challenge, I think, and you hit the nail on the head, it's not trickling down. You look at the prices we're paying, retail and wholesale, check box beef and where it's at versus the 106, the 110 cash bids out in the countryside in Iowa, and there's a big discrepancy. The challenge I think we are going to face, and I've been talking about this for a couple years, we peaked in 2014. Was that the cattle market peak? 13. 14. So that was a fun year. That was a year that we saw everybody holding back every cow on the farm, keeping every heifer expand, and we grew like crazy as an industry. Not just in South Dakota, this happened in Iowa. In 2015, they were putting fences up in Iowa. We've been tearing fences out for 50 years. But we had people getting back into the beef industry because we hit those high prices. That was a wave 5. That beef market in 2014, euphoria, and that hen has come home to roost, or whatever the saying is. Now we're on the backside of that. We're in a market where retail demand is exceptional. So is calf production. And I hate to say this, I've raised cattle for years. I'm very passionate about the industry, But when we saw that first report out of the flooding in Nebraska that 1 million calves had been lost, I thought this might be something that could give us a little bit of a spark. And now, of course, that was not true. Thank God we didn't lose 1 million calves, but we just have too many calves. At the end of the day, what we saw happen in 2014 was we incredibly grew our breeding stock. At the same time, I work with a number of smaller farmer feeders in Iowa, the 1 to 1,000 head guys, open lots. 2014, 2015, 2016 saw a lot of guys go out of business. A lot of guys were buying up those calves in 2014. They were putting them in the lots, and they're losing $1,000 a head on them. So today, in 2019, we're dealing with a situation where we still have more calves than we have had in at least since the early 1970s, and we're dealing with a situation where we have many, many fewer feed yards. In particular, we've lost those little guys. They didn't feed a lot of head, but they sat at the sale barn, and they were arms in the air, and we don't have those bidders anymore. And that, I think, is the root cause of our concern, and I think this is going to be an issue for ranchers, for the cow-calf man, for the next 4 or 5 years, unless something really big happens. And I don't know what that really big thing could be, but I am pessimistic about the feeder cattle producer for the next little bit. We did what we do too well. That's my take. But Sue, what do you think?
Well, I think that there's cycles in the markets, and in the old days, when you had grain prices coming down, meat prices tended to go up, or cattle prices, and vice versa. And now we have the grain market bottoming out, has bottomed out, and is turning stronger. So I think that the cattle market's going to be a little tenuous for a little bit. And probably as we go through the first half of next year while corn prices are high. Part of the thing I think that you'll see, we have, if you look around, pasture land looks wonderful. Plenty of moisture for pastures. I think that feeds the cow-calf man. And you buy these calves and you put them out on pasture. And I think that is going to help keep a demand out there. But the problem is, we're not into a liquidation or anything like that. The demand for beef is good. It's good for any protein, actually. And I do think our exports are going to turn and pick back up. One thing that Mike touched on was basically, bottom line, the division in the House between the Democrats and the Republicans. They need to work together. You're not getting a darn thing done. And the sad thing is, the one that really bothers me is the U.S.-Mexico-Canadian agreement. That should have been agreed upon, and when I heard Chuck Schumer last November 13th, I was in Kearney, Nebraska speaking. And that morning, before I went to go speak, I heard Chuck Schumer make a comment. Well, we're going to have to review this. And I thought, oh no, here we go. And sure enough, and agriculture needs both sides working on their benefit. Let these guys go hungry for a little bit and let them figure it out, where that food actually comes from. And their prices go higher in the grocery store because besides the packer making the money or the wholesaler, they need to figure it out that the farmer, there's only so many of you. And you do a good job and you produce the product and a quality product. But they need to take care of the food chain for the producers in their country. And I think they get short-sighted sometimes. And they're so political right now. And instead, they're taking that agreement as an issue. And it should have been passed a long time ago.
And I've got just one other thing that you've got me thinking, and then I'll shut up, I promise. Okay. One of the huge problems we have, and bless anybody for making a dollar, they got to do it the way they can. I look at packer returns at $250 to $300 a head when we got feedlots going under, and there's something amiss going on there. And to my mind, the problem is we just don't have competition. We've got the 4 packers. That's the root of a lot of this in my mind, this kind of concentration of whatever profits at the top. I'm really encouraged. We've seen several states try this. I don't know about South Dakota, but I've got a feeling the folks are here who could answer this. But Iowa has recently made a request to the USDA to allow our state-licensed lockers and meat processors to be able to sell across state lines without a USDA inspection. Does that sound right? Something like that. And so the idea is, now me, small-time cattle feeder, I can go to the Malcolm locker 30 miles away, get my beef processed, and then retail it across state lines. If we can do something like that, get a more common sense regulatory regime that would allow more choice in the cattle finishing and processing realm, then all of a sudden, you're not stuck taking the 110 bid at the farm gate from the packer. You can tell him to shove it sideways, and you can go and finish all the beef yourself and assume a little bit more market risk. It's not a huge change. I mean, we're not going to see a 100,000 head feed yard all of a sudden look to do this sort of thing. But it's one of those things that is changing at the margins, and it's by adding more competition into the food chain that we can help get those dollars to come back. Because at the end of the day, just like the cow-calf man is selling into an auction ring with fewer hands going in the air, the cattle feeder is selling to 4 packers. There's 4 hands at every sale barn for fat cattle. And it's the same 2 cattle buyers buying for all 4 places. The more competition we have, the more hands we're going to see go in the air, and that's going to do some good things for price. But I think we're several years away from adding any kind of real competition into the meat industry. Okay.
As a cattle producer, I would suggest buying your corn out ahead and doing so on in through July of next year. I would do it, I would have it protected one way or the other. Either the problem's going to be if corn does see an inverted basis next year, generally, and boy, just think if there is an early frost freeze. Just think if they're right. I have to tell you that price is going to be very high, and you're going to have an inverted basis. So as a feed user, your end user, you're going to have to pay on that basis. And so you can buy on the board and protect yourself that way, but the problem is that only protects part of it. It doesn't protect the basis that you're going to end up having to pay, if I'm right on that. But I would have protection or have feed locked up. One thing about this crop, it may not store well on the farm. We could be looking at a crop this year that just does not store. And that's going to be an issue too. Thank you.
Thank you again to Sue and Mike. I would also be remiss if we didn't take a minute to thank the Lieutenant Governor Roden for being with us today. So let's give him a round. At this time, we will take a short recess for an afternoon networking break. We're going to have to make it pretty quick, though. You got 9 minutes. So stretch your legs. Please help yourself to a snack and drinks in the back. And we will reconvene promptly at 3:45.